Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going back a couple of years,
Oh,
in
yeah.
November 2022, to Moscow, Idaho.
Yeah.
Picture a typical college town home to the University of Idaho. Life seemed pretty idyllic
Yeah.
until it wasn't. This is the story of the four University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, who were tragically murdered in their off-campus house.
Yeah, and what makes this case so fascinating, even years later, is just the mystery that surrounded it initially. It wasn't just a whodunit, it was also a how and a why.
Right.
For weeks, the investigation just seemed to hit dead end after dead end,
And
when it really left the community and honestly the whole country on edge.
Right. It felt like every few days there was a new detail, a new theory, but no real answers.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're really going to try to unpack not just what happened, but what we've learned since then.
Right.
What does the evidence tell us?
Yeah.
What's the latest on the trial? And perhaps most intriguing, what does the suspect's background in criminology suggest about this case?
Right, we've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's start by setting the scene. It was November 13th, a Saturday night. Think, typical college weekend parties, friends hanging out, that kind of vibe. Kaylee and Madison were at a local bar called the Corner Club, while Xana and Ethan were at a party at the Sigma Chi House.
And thankfully, thanks to security footage and even a Twitch live stream, we have a pretty clear picture of their movements that night.
Yeah,
It's almost eerie how normal everything seems,
I know.
knowing what's coming.
Yeah, and you're right around 1:50 a.m. We see Kaylee and Madison at a food truck. They're laughing, chatting with friends, seemingly without a care in the world. They get their food and head home around 1:50 a.m. By 2 a.m., all four students are back at the house on King Road.
So from what we know, it seems like a pretty ordinary night out.
Yeah.
But then things take a darker turn, right?
Yeah.
There's that detail about the unanswered calls to Keely's ex-boyfriend in the early morning hours.
Yeah, between 2:26 and 2:52 a.m., Kaylee's phone shows 7 unanswered calls to her ex-boyfriend. Madison also tried calling him a few times. And this immediately sparked a lot of speculation, but investigators were able to pretty thoroughly rule him out as a suspect.
Okay.
It just goes to show you how, in a case like this, every lead needs to be explored,
Right.
even if it ends up being a dead end.
It's like trying to piece together a giant complex puzzle.
Exactly.
Now, somewhere around 4 a.m., a DoorDash order that was placed for Xana arrives at the house. This detail places us very close to the estimated time of the murders.
Right, and that's where the, known timeline essentially stops. The next piece of the puzzle comes later that morning when the horrific discovery was made. So let's shift our focus now to the crime scene itself. It was brutal.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine walking into that house.
Yeah.
The victims were found on the second and third floors. Multiple stab wounds, likely from a fixed blade knife.
Yeah.
There were reports of blood splattered on the walls. It paints a truly terrifying picture.
It does. And what makes it even more chilling is that there was no sign of forced entry. This suggests that the killer or killers either knew the victims or were able to get in undetected. You also have to consider the psychological impact this has on the community, knowing that this seemingly random act of violence could happen to anyone.
Right, it really shattered that sense of safety that you often associate with college towns. And then there's the detail about Kaylee's dog being found unharmed inside the house.
Right. Amidst all of that horror, you have this little glimmer of, I don't know if I'd say hope, but maybe a question mark. Why was the dog spared? It adds another layer of mystery to the case. Was this truly a random act of violence, or was there something more targeted going on?
It definitely raises more questions than answers.
Yeah.
So with a crime scene this disturbing and so many unknowns, where did investigators even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, as you can imagine, this case involved a massive multi-agency investigation. The Moscow Police Department, the Idaho State Police, even the FBI were all involved. Thousands of tips poured in from the public. There were autopsies, forensic analysis.
Oh, wow.
Every possible resource was being utilized to try and track down the killer.
I remember just being glued to the news, waiting for any updates,
Yeah.
any breakthroughs in the case.
I think a lot of us were.
Yeah.
It was a case that just gripped the nation. Now, early on, the autopsies provided some crucial details. The victims were likely asleep when they were attacked,
Right.
and at least one of them had fought back.
Wow, I hadn't heard that detail before.
Yeah.
So what really ended up cracking the case wide open?
There were actually 2 key things. First, there was the eyewitness account from one of the surviving roommates.
Wait, there were other people in the house that night?
That's right. There were 2 other roommates who were home during the attacks, though thankfully they weren't harmed.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What did this roommate see?
Well, she told investigators that she woke up several times throughout the night. Once she heard what sounded like Kaylee playing with her dog. Then she thought she heard another roommate say something like, "There's someone here." Investigators now believe that voice may have actually been Xana's based on activity on her phone around 4:21 a.m.
That's so close to the estimated time of the murders.
Right.
What happened next?
Well, she opened her bedroom door a few times but didn't see anything.
Okay.
Then she opened it again and saw a man dressed in black wearing a mask walking towards her.
Oh my gosh, that must have been terrifying. Did she recognize him?
No, unfortunately not. She described him as a male about 5'10", athletically built but not overly muscular with bushy eyebrows.
Oh, wow.
She was understandably in shock and locked herself in her room.
It's hard to even fathom what that experience must have been like for her.
Absolutely. Now here's the second key piece of the puzzle. Remember all those tips that were pouring in?
Yeah.
Well, one of them led investigators to security footage from the area that captured a white Elantra driving around the victim's house multiple times in the hours leading up to the murders.
So a white Elantra became a crucial piece of evidence. Did that lead them directly to the suspect?
It did, but not right away. Investigators used that detail along with public records and other surveillance footage to slowly start narrowing down their search. It was like putting together a giant complex puzzle, and this was a major piece.
And that's how they found Bryan Kohberger.
Exactly. Kohberger was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University, not far from Moscow. Now, his car wasn't the exact model year they were initially looking for, but it matched the description closely enough to raise suspicion.
Criminology. That's a chilling detail.
It is, isn't it? You have someone studying crime, potentially learning about how to avoid detection, right in the vicinity of this horrific crime.
So how did they go from suspicion to actually connecting him to the murders?
DNA investigators were able to obtain DNA from trash that was collected at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, and it matched DNA found at the crime scene.
Wow, a DNA match. That's pretty irrefutable evidence. What happened next?
Well, with that evidence, they had enough for an arrest. On December 30th, 2022, a little over 6 weeks after the murders, Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home.
It sounds like they had a pretty strong case against him.
They did. And this is where things get really interesting because we have to consider the implications of his background in criminology. Did this knowledge influence how he allegedly committed the crime? Did he think he could outsmart investigators?
That's a fascinating question. It's almost like something out of a crime novel. A criminology student turned alleged murderer.
Exactly. It raises all sorts of questions about motivation psychology and the ethics of studying criminal behavior.
So before we dive into all of that, let's quickly recap what we know about Kohberger himself.
Well, at the time of his arrest, he was 28 years old, a teaching assistant in the WSU criminology department. He had previously earned degrees in psychology and criminal justice from other universities.
So clearly someone deeply interested in the criminal mind. What was his demeanor like after the arrest?
Reports described him as calm, collected, almost unsettlingly so. But there were also reports of some unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to the arrest. For example, he was allegedly seen wearing surgical gloves and meticulously cleaning his car inside and out.
Those details definitely raise some red flags. So where does the case stand now?
Well, Kohberger was extradited back to Idaho, and he's currently awaiting trial. He was indicted by a grand jury on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary.
And he's pleaded not guilty.
That's right. The trial has been moved to Boise, Idaho, due to all the publicity, and the prosecution is seeking the death penalty. It's going to be a high-profile trial with both sides likely bringing in expert witnesses and presenting very different interpretations of the evidence.
So there's still a long road ahead in this case. It's hard to imagine what the families of the victims are going through, having to relive all of this as the trial unfolds.
Absolutely. And the community as a whole is still grappling with the trauma of what happened. It's a case that has left a lasting impact, raising questions not just about justice, but about the very nature of evil and the dark side of human potential.
Well said. I think this is a good place to pause for now. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into Kohberger's background and what his studies might reveal about this case. We'll also discuss the potential legal strategies and what to expect as the trial gets underway.
Stay with us.
Okay, so we've laid out like the basic timeline and the facts of the case, but now let's get into what I find the most perplexing aspect. Kohberger's background in criminology. You'd think someone immersed in the study of crime would be more aware of how to avoid getting caught, right?
Right. That's the very question a lot of people have been asking. And it's one that investigators and, legal experts will likely be grappling with throughout this trial. Some argue that Kohberger's knowledge might have made him overconfident, leading him to underestimate the investigative process.
That's a really interesting point. It reminds me of that saying, like, Familiarity breeding contempt.
Right.
Maybe he felt like he understood the system so well that he could exploit it.
It's certainly possible. Others suggest that his criminology background could have fueled a dangerous fascination with crime,
Hmm.
blurring the lines between academic curiosity and a morbid desire to experience it firsthand.
That's chilling to think about.
Yeah.
It almost makes you wonder if there's a psychological profile that might predispose someone to this kind of crossover.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about that, especially in the field of forensic psychology. Some experts have pointed to the dark triad personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, as potential risk factors for criminal behavior, even among those studying it.
So in theory, someone with these traits might be drawn to criminology because it feeds their fascination with power control and manipulation.
Exactly. They might view it as a way to gain insights into the vulnerabilities of others, or even as a challenge, a way to test their ability to outsmart the system.
It's like a real-life, incredibly disturbing game of cat and mouse.
In a sense, yes. But it's crucial to remember that we're talking about a very small subset of individuals.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people who study criminology are driven by a desire to understand crime, prevent it, and bring justice to victims.
Of course, it's important to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right.
Just because Kohberger studied criminology doesn't automatically mean that his studies influenced his alleged actions.
Precisely. The trial will likely delve deeper into his psychological state, exploring potential motives, his behavior leading up to the crimes, and any evidence that his studies played a direct role in the case.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk a bit about the upcoming trial. What are some of the key arguments we might see from both sides?
Well, for the prosecution, the DNA evidence is going to be a cornerstone of their case.
Right.
They'll likely argue that the DNA match found at the crime scene, coupled with the eyewitness account and the white Elantra footage, creates an undeniable link between Kohberger and the murders.
And the defense. How will they counter that kind of evidence?
Well, they might try to challenge the integrity of the DNA evidence, perhaps arguing that there was contamination or mishandling during the collection or analysis process. They could also attempt to discredit the eyewitness testimony, highlighting the potential for error in memory, especially in a high-stress situation like witnessing a crime.
That makes sense. Eyewitness accounts are notoriously tricky, and forensics, while often presented as foolproof, is not without its flaws.
Right. The defense will also need to present an alternative explanation for Kohberger's presence near the crime scene and for any other incriminating evidence. They might suggest that he was in the area for innocent reasons, or that the evidence was planted or misinterpreted.
It sounds like this trial is going to be a battle of experts with both sides presenting their own interpretations of the evidence.
It will be. And it's important for the jury to carefully weigh the evidence presented, considering both the strength and limitations of different types of forensic analysis, eyewitness testimony, and expert opinions.
Speaking of the jury, you mentioned earlier that Kohberger was indicted by a grand jury. Can you explain what that means for those of us who might not be familiar with legal procedures?
Absolutely. A grand jury is a group of citizens who are convened to determine whether there is enough evidence to bring formal charges against someone. Unlike a trial jury, which decides guilt or innocence, a grand jury simply decides whether there's probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that the accused person is likely responsible.
So in this case, the grand jury heard the prosecution's evidence and determined that there was enough to move forward with the trial.
Exactly. And now a different trial jury will be selected to hear all the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defense and ultimately decide whether Kohberger is guilty or not guilty of the charges against him.
Got it. It's a complex system, but it's designed to ensure that everyone gets a fair hearing.
It is. And it's a reminder of the importance of due process and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty.
So as we move closer to the trial, what are some of the key things to keep in mind?
I think it's essential to approach this case with a critical eye, recognizing that there's a lot we still don't know. We need to be wary of sensationalized media coverage and focus on the facts as they're presented in court.
That's good advice. It's easy to get caught up in the emotion and speculation surrounding a case like this. But it's important to remember that justice relies on a fair and impartial evaluation of the evidence.
Exactly. And regardless of the trial's outcome, this case will undoubtedly have a lasting impact, not just on the families of the victims, but on our understanding of criminal behavior, the role of forensic science, and the ongoing debate about the death penalty.
You're right. It's a case that forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the darkness that can exist within seemingly ordinary people, and the challenges we face in understanding and preventing such horrific acts.
And it reminds us of the importance of supporting the victims and their families, who are often forgotten amidst the media frenzy and legal battles.
Well said. We'll be sure to keep our listeners updated on the trial as it progresses. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact this case has had on the Moscow community.
Yes. I think that's a crucial aspect to explore. This wasn't just a crime that happened in a vacuum. It deeply affected a community, leaving behind a legacy of fear, grief, and a profound sense of loss.
And while the community is still healing, they've also shown incredible resilience. There have been vigils, memorials, and countless acts of kindness and support.
Absolutely. The University of Idaho has established scholarships in the names of the victims, and there are plans for a memorial garden on campus to honor their memory.
Those are beautiful tributes.
Yeah.
It shows that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, there's a powerful urge to find meaning, to honor those we've lost, and to move forward with hope and determination.
Exactly. It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the importance of community in times of crisis.
It's been really insightful discussing the investigative and legal aspects of this case and the impact on the community. But now I want to circle back to Kohberger and the psychology behind his alleged actions.
Yeah, I think that's a natural progression. We've talked about the facts, the evidence, but understanding the why behind such horrific acts is often what captivates and perplexes us the most.
Okay, so we've already touched upon Kohberger's background in criminology and how that might have played a role. But what else can you tell us about his psychological profile?
Well, based on reports and observations, some experts have speculated that Kohberger might exhibit traits consistent with a specific type of offender known as an organized offender.
Organized offender. I've heard that term before in true crime documentaries. What does that mean exactly?
So it's a classification system used in criminal profiling to categorize offenders based on certain behavioral patterns and characteristics. Organized offenders tend to be more methodical, planned, and controlled in their crimes.
So they're not acting on impulse or in a fit of rage?
Exactly. They typically exhibit a higher degree of intelligence and social competence. They often take steps to minimize risk, select their victims carefully, and maintain a level of control over the crime scene.
Would you say that Kohberger's alleged actions align with this profile?
We'll consider the details we've discussed, the lack of forced entry, the fact that the surviving roommates were unharmed, the potential attempts to cover his tracks. These could all point towards a level of planning and control.
That's a disturbing thought. It makes the crime seem even more calculated and sinister.
It does, but again, it's important to emphasize that these are just potential interpretations based on available information.
Right. The trial will hopefully shed more light on Kohberger's motivations and state of mind.
It will. And it'll be fascinating to see how the prosecution and defense use expert testimony to paint a picture of who Kohberger is, what might have driven him to commit such horrific acts, and ultimately whether he is legally responsible for the deaths of these 4 young people.
So it's clear that this case goes far beyond a simple whodunit.
It does. It raises fundamental questions about human nature, the complexities of the criminal mind, and the challenges we face in understanding and preventing such acts of violence.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the chilling details of the crime scene to the intricacies of the legal process. But for me, it's this question of why that continues to linger. What could drive someone to commit such a horrific act?
That's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. And while we may never fully understand the darkness that resides in some hearts, I think it's our responsibility to keep seeking answers, to learn from these tragedies, and to work towards a world where such acts of violence are less likely to occur.
You're right. It's about finding ways to prevent future tragedies, to support victims and their families, and to create a society where everyone feels safe and valued.
Exactly. And that's a conversation that needs to continue long after the verdict is delivered in this case.
Well said. I think this is a good place to pause for now. When we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive by considering the broader implications of this case. We'll explore what it tells us about the ethics of studying criminal behavior, the challenges of forensic science, and the ongoing debate about the death penalty.
Stay with us.
All right, so we've dissected the details of the crime, we've explored the investigation, we've tried to understand the potential motivations of the suspect, but now I kind of want to zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
This case really got people talking about the ethics of studying criminal behavior. It almost feels paradoxical, right?
Yeah.
Someone dedicating their life to understanding crime, then allegedly committing a horrific crime themselves.
It's a question that has been debated in, academic circles for a very long time. Some argue that Studying criminology can desensitize individuals to violence or normalize criminal behavior or even provide like a blueprint for carrying out crimes.
Yeah, that's a pretty unsettling thought, but I imagine there's another side to that argument.
Oh, of course. Many criminologists would counter that their work is essential for preventing crime, understanding its root causes, and developing, effective rehabilitation programs. They would argue that studying crime doesn't make someone more likely to commit it. In fact, it might do the opposite, instill a deeper understanding of the devastating consequences of criminal actions.
So it seems like a classic nature versus nurture debate, right? Is it the exposure to criminal behavior that's the problem, or is it more about pre-existing personality traits or psychological vulnerabilities that draw certain individuals to this field in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's likely a complex interplay of both. There's no simple answer, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out in the trial.
Yeah.
Will the prosecution try to use Kohberger's studies against him, painting him as someone who was drawn to the darkness and used his knowledge for nefarious purposes?
Right. And would the defense counter that his studies actually prove his innocence?
Right.
Like he wouldn't have committed such a sloppy crime if he was really using his expertise to his advantage.
Exactly. It's going to be a fascinating legal strategy to watch unfold. And beyond the legal implications, this case has really forced us to confront the limitations of forensic science.
Oh, how so?
Well, we tend to view forensic evidence as, the ultimate truth teller.
Yeah.
DNA, fingerprints. It all seems so definitive on, TV crime shows, but in reality, it's much more nuanced.
Right. We've talked about how DNA evidence, while incredibly powerful, can still be subject to contamination or misinterpretation.
Exactly. And that's where the role of human judgment comes in. Scientists, investigators, lawyers, they all bring their own biases and interpretations to the table. And the way evidence is presented, analyzed, and ultimately weighed by a jury can have a huge impact on the outcome of a case.
It makes you realize that justice isn't always black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and the truth can be sometimes elusive.
Absolutely. And this case also brings up another major debate, the death penalty.
Yeah, right. The prosecution is seeking the death penalty for Kohberger if he's found guilty. It's such a complex and emotionally charged issue.
It is, and this case has really reignited discussions about the morality, effectiveness, and fairness of capital punishment. There are strong arguments on both sides.
On one hand, you have people who believe that the death penalty is a just punishment for certain crimes, that it provides a sense of closure for victims' families, and that it deters future crime.
And on the other hand, you have those who argue that it's cruel and unusual punishment, that it's irreversible and therefore subject to human error, and that it doesn't actually deter crime.
It's a debate that likely won't be resolved anytime soon. But this case really puts a very human face on that debate, forcing us to really grapple with the weight of those decisions and the profound consequences they have on everyone involved.
It does. And it reminds us that justice is about more than just punishment. It's about accountability, rehabilitation, and ultimately trying to prevent future tragedies from happening.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I can't help but think back to the victims and their families. Their lives were cut short, their futures stolen. And while justice might bring some measure of solace, it can never truly heal that kind of loss.
It can't. And I think it's so important to remember that amidst all the legal complexities, the forensic analysis, the psychological profiles at the heart of this case are 4 young people who were loved, who had dreams, who deserved a chance to live their lives.
Well said. Their story is a reminder of the preciousness of life, the fragility of our existence, and the importance of cherishing every moment.
It is. And while this case has been a very dark and disturbing journey, I hope this deep dive has given you, the listener, a better understanding of its complexities, the questions it raises, and the ongoing conversations that it has sparked.
I think it has. And as we sign off, we just want to encourage you to continue exploring this case, to think critically about the information that you encounter, and to form your own conclusions.
Remember, justice is a process, and it's one that requires our active engagement, our empathy, and our unwavering commitment to seeking the truth.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating case that's sure to challenge your assumptions and keep you on the edge of your seat. Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.